I hope you'll forgive me this week because I accidentally read something by William Lane Craig. And
well, that was your first mistake.
Well, that was the mistake. As I read it, because it was provided to me by someone else, it wasn't until about midway through that I was like, oh, I know who this is. I know who this is.
I've had this headache before.
Yeah, and I mean, I generally try and avoid his work because it's just the most asinine arguments that you can come up with. But
let's dive in anyway.
Let's see what this one was about. So there was a couple of questions in this forum that were apparently to William Lane Craig, and I didn't realize. And it says they were raising the issue of God commanding the Jews to commit genocide.
Right.
And they were even asking the harder question is the killing of children and infants when you have these soldiers commit the genocide.
Right.
If the children are young enough, along with the infants, are innocent of the sins that their society has committed. And so, like, how do we reconcile that? So that was one person questioning. Additionally, a second person question says, do you see any difference between your justification of the Old Testament violence and Islamic justification of Muhammad and violent verses in the Quran? Is the violence and morally questionable actions and verses of the Quran a good argument while talking to Muslims? So those were the two questions that he put to them.
Okay.
And so part of William Lane Craig's answers were things like that we know the God of the Hebrew Bible is a God of justice, long-suffering, and compassion.
How do we know that?
Well, we don't, but that's what William Lane Craig does, is he asserts that we know these things that we have no evidence for. But I wanted to mention that because of the fact that he specifically mentions that he's long-suffering. He gives three good properties.
Well, he likes it when people
God
suffer
of
for a long
justice
time.
and compassion and long-suffering.
Well, I would say that the God of the Bible knows nothing about justice, but...
right, but why... I mean, you're making an argument for your God. Why throw in long-suffering as though it's good? He's giving that as a good reason.
I think it's the idea that God is long-suffering in the sense that he will put up with sinful nature as long as he can. He will suffer the affront to him.
It's long self-suffering.
Right. He will suffer the affront to him that your sin is for as long as he can.
Okay. So continuing, he continues to just make these kind of bad arguments, but he then notes that the Old Testament itself contains the Ten Commandments, one of the greatest and of ancient moral codes.
If you say so.
Yeah, which, I mean, Ten Commandments is an absolute laughable joke. I mean, like, the things about, like, honoring thy father and the mother, like, if you have an abusive father that beats you daily, or especially if you're a woman that rapes you when you're a young girl and things like that, you do not have to honor that person.
As far as I'm concerned, no.
But, you know, the Ten Commandments doesn't leave room for that because they are objective and solid, and they are yes-no toggles, and that's the end of it. Yeah. And so he goes on to justify that this goes, I guess, actually, now that I'm seeing it, to the long-suffering that he's talking about, God being long-suffering and tolerant, I guess is what he should have said.
Right.
Because then he talks about how Abraham was trying to talk, God out of, like, destroying the... I believe Sodom and Gomorrah, because of the idea that what if there's 50 righteous people in the city,
right.
And God kept saying, well, even if there are 50, even if there are 10, I won't destroy it. But he destroys it anyway.
Right.
So
apparently they didn't find any righteous people.
The point that William Lane Craig will make is that there are 0 righteous people, and it is precisely because we have come to expect Yahweh to act justly and with compassion that we find these stories to be so difficult to understand. And, I couldn't agree more. And what he goes on to say, though, is that this is almost like what you were talking about earlier with the guy that, if you see a paradox and you don't understand it, it's your fault. Just hit your head harder against the wall until you understand the paradox.
Understand it, yeah.
And that's basically what he goes on to, because he's saying, okay, we see this conflict, but just understand, we know that God is just, so we have to force ourselves to understand that he has a reason, that it is justified.
I still want to know how he knows that God is just, but whatever.
Exactly. I mean, because that's this is where Christians are so hard to argue with, and so hard to have this discussion and get them to make any leeway in their thought process, because it is this mindset of, like, they know certain things to be true, and no matter what you say against that, they have a wraparound to say, but we know that you're wrong, because that's even what he says, because he goes on to give basically the proof of God, and if you didn't know, it can be done in 3 easy steps that make no sense at all. Number 1, if God does not exist, then objective morals do not exist. Okay? Number 2, objective morals do exist.
Okay.
Number 3, therefore God exists.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Huge no.
You're actually wrong. Please demonstrate to me how you know that objective moral values exist. And then, even if you could prove that, that doesn't prove that God exists. That proves that objective moral values exist.
Well, and objective moral values, I mean, they basically can't possibly exist
Right.
because you have such the variety of humans, and even the Ten Commandments shows you a sign of like that objective moral values cannot exist, because in that it even says that thou shalt not kill, and it's given by God. Okay, and if it was an objective moral value, then that means that you could not even kill in the name of God. It doesn't specify that in the Ten Commandments, and it doesn't specify it as murder. It specifies it as killing, because he'll go
Right.
on to justify that these soldiers killing women and children when they commit their genocide, that it's not murder because of the fact that it's given by
justice,
God,
yeah.
and he's alluding to the idea that then it's not breaking the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments are not murder specific.
Right. But the thing that I've heard, the explanation that I've heard for this one is that in Hebrew culture, that thou shalt not kill meant within the tribe.
Oh well, that makes it so much better. So that would justify that it's murder, but I mean I don't agree with that.
No, well, I don't either, and it's still.
I mean, every
it's
translation
still,
I see is just "thou shalt not kill."
Yeah, it's still ludicrous. It still becomes this idea of, because there's two problems. This is actually a very old argument. If there is objective morality, then even God is subject to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because it means that that morality he cannot violate it. So it's like he's under some kind of system. And so the immediate question is, where does that system come from? Mm-hmm. Who set those morals down? Because it either is or it isn't if it's objective.
Well,
if morality is just whatever God says, so if God says don't kill those people, that becomes moral to not kill people. But then when God says go kill those people, it becomes moral to kill those people, which means it's absolutely subjective. God is deciding it on a whim, and it means that there is no objective morality.
well,
So you're sort of screwed either direction that you go when you're trying to make a claim like this. And even so, Craig has not. He's saying objective morality does exist. How do you know that?
Well, because he knows that his God.
Right, exactly.
provided
It's a
objective-
totally
it's
circular
logic.
argument. Objective morality exists because God exists, and God exists because objective morality exists. No,
Yeah.
that's not an argument.
Yeah, the point that I want to make with God and making the morals is I think that you could justify and say that God makes the morals and that's why they're objective, because he makes them. But then he changes them throughout the Bible, which then means they are subjective to him, and that the
Right.
only objective morality we have is what he tells us. So
Right.
you have that situation where if God comes down and says, you know what, kill your firstborn, as a sacrifice again.
It's moral.
That brings that back. That's moral. It's the right thing to do.
Right.
Totally popular, right? I mean, plus on top of like this idea that even if you prove that, because he says if God does not exist, objective morals do not exist.
Okay.
And it's like, well, you could actually still have in a situation where somehow objective morals do exist. It does nothing about
Right.
objective morality that ties back to God.
A does
I
not
mean, that's a
equal
complete
B.
non sequitur.
Right. A does not equal B. But he's setting it up to make it sound like it does.
Exactly. So he says that the issue with God commanding the Israeli soldiers to kill these people and end the Canaanites' existence and things like that is that he says, isn't that like commanding someone to commit murder? No, it's not. Rather, since our moral duties are determined by God's command, it is commanding someone to do something which, in the absence of a divine command, would have been murder. So it's just
Yeah.
what we said.
Yeah.
If God tells you to do it, then it's okay.
Right.
Otherwise, it's not okay. But if God tells, so
And
that
how
makes
do we
God the
determine-
ultimate puppet master.
Yeah. How do we determine if God told us to or not? I think back to the case a couple years ago where a woman thought that God told her to kill her children and she drowned them in the bathtub. How do we as a society convict her of that crime?
Yeah. Maybe God
Or,
told her.
I mean,
it
I
was
think
okay.
actually in the case, she got sent to a mental institution because obviously she's hearing voices and she has some kind of, she's sick.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, really, if this is how can William Lane Craig look at that woman and say that anything, but she should be free because she did a moral act? He has no method of saying that.
Well, yeah,
he believes God
again,
talks to people.
How do you determine who he's talking to? How do we know that? I mean, that's the part of why you can't go about believing these things for no reason whatsoever, because of the fact that if he's talking to you and if he's telling you that this is how things are done, but he's not talking to us, like, how the hell are we supposed to all get along and all cooperate when, you know, because it's the same thing of, like, the Mormons that tell me, you know, just pray and you'll feel his presence. It's like, I did that. I did that for them for so long, trying to understand and trying to empathize with their position, because I couldn't understand why they went to church and did all these things that I just, you know,
couldn't wrap your head around.
Yeah, and so then I would, you know, open myself to those ideas, and I don't feel shit. So it's like, either God has a plan for me and it's to fuck up your world, or he's just completely abandoned me and he does not love us all.
Right.
You know, or you're delusional. I mean, which one's more likely?
It's more likely that you're delusional, considering how many people we have running around claiming that they know the mind of God, or various gods, that we have no method of determining which one of you is actually talking to God.
Well, especially because you all conflict with each other.
Right, exactly. Which is why it's more like, I mean, you can't all be right, but you can't all be wrong.
Exactly.
So...
So by the time he mentions here that by the time of their destruction, the Canaanite culture, in fact, debauched and cruel, embracing such practices as ritual prostitution, which actually kind of sounds fun, and even child sacrifice. The Canaanites are to be destroyed. They may not teach you to do to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God.
Do you know what this reminds me of? There is actually a direct corollary in history to that exact statement.
Really?
When the Roman Empire destroyed the Empire of Carthage, which was an empire, an African empire, the thing that the Romans did afterwards, because they sacked the cities, this empire never rose again as a nation. They enslaved people, they looted it, they did everything. The thing that the Romans said afterwards, they did child sacrifice, they were totally debauched, they were evil. It was a moral action for us to destroy them. I don't think that they said that the gods commanded that it be done, but this is totally a case. The Hebrews wiped out a tribe, and then the victors wrote history, and they were like, this is why we did it.
Yeah,
don't question us.
Yep.
This is our justification, and it's the exact same thing the Romans did.
That's an
There
interesting
is
point.
no indication in archaeology, in the studying of Carthage, that any of this stuff happened. The only mention of it comes from the Roman accounts. What do we know about the Canaanites that comes from somewhere else than this? Do we know that there was debauchery, child sacrifice, ritual prostitution? Which, who even cares? But
I do not have all the facts present for that.
I know, but I'm stating that no one probably does.
No, but I have specifically seen archaeological articles and videos that kind of contradict the Canaanite culture issue.
Yeah.
Because when it's described in the Bible, it's like these walled cities, these huge walled cities that were conquered, and they spread the Canaanites out to all these little small tribes because they pretty much demolished it and they had to whole kind of scurry away.
Right.
But apparently the archaeological studies show that the Canaanite region was actually started as small pods of people and eventually came together and became the city that
which you would sort of expect,
right? But the city wasn't actually ever conquered, so it's the Bible tells history in reverse of that. This huge city was there, they killed them all and they spread them out, but apparently it was actually because the Canaanites made their money off of they became these tribespeople that became market people,
merchants,
thank you. And and then had the walled cities, and apparently the walled city literally Roman Empire style fell apart in the sense that it could no longer support itself, and so then it spread back out, but it was never conquered archaeologically.
Well, no one ever accused the Bible of being archaeologically correct.
Most people do.
No one who's ever studied archaeology ever accused the Bible of being correct.
So, and as another justification for, okay, we've gotten past the fact that God says this is moral, it's the right thing to do, and he's let the soldiers do it. And he was saying, he notes this kind of flaw in it, and then tries to hide it. He says, can you imagine what it would be like to break into someone's house and kill a terrified woman and her children? The brutalizing effect on these Israeli soldiers is disturbing. He says, but then again, life was brutal. Violence and war were a fact of life for these people, and so that makes it okay. So because they lived in this like brutal life moment, and what I question about this is like, so what happens then if he came back and commanded the Americas to conquer Mexico? And like have regular people like you and me in a life that is not brutal.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to go purge Mexico of its people. Like, does it still make it okay? I mean,
well,
was it okay
process,
back then because they had a brutal life, so it's okay to command it? So, but God won't do it now because we don't have a brutal life? I don't I mean, the...
He's trying to justify it, and there's just no way he can.
The other thing that he likes to note is that no one was wringing hands over the soldiers killing the Canaanites and their children and so on and so forth. That they were, they would be praised as national heroes, which is like...
Wait, what is he saying?
He's saying that we shouldn't, be feeling bad for them because they wouldn't come home and people would be like, oh my God, you killed those children, you're so horrible. No, they would come back and they'd be sung as heroes.
Well, if people back in Israel didn't wring their hands over the idea that the Israeli soldiers were slaughtering the Canaanites, and actually, we don't know that wasn't happening, we just didn't hear about it in the book.
Right.
Because this is written by the victors of a war. It didn't include the fact that, well, some people felt really bad about it.
Well, I think you actually do see that. I mean, even in like an American, as part of the war machine, you see when we do these things, we get this like praise on a national level of like, oh, we're doing all these good things and of conquering these certain people or helping, bringing them freedom or whatever.
But nowadays we hear about like the incredible suicide rate among veterans.
Right.
We hear about the tolls that war has on people, that you can't just, even if this person is your enemy and trying to kill you, you can't just shoot dozens of people and then not have a problem with it later to be like, I can't believe I did this thing.
But the point that I was trying to make is that most of the time, in the majority of the American kind of mindset, you respect these soldiers and you have a great amount of respect for what they do, and even the wars that are maybe you could morally justify in some way or something like that. I don't justify most of them, but you can, and it's not until you get these like off stories about like the soldiers like peeing on the dead bodies or things like that then suddenly you have the hand wringing. And my point is that with this, people don't think about that level of war until the news comes back.
Right.
But so when you're in this old time where you don't have that kind of news and they just go and conquer and they just come back and they're like, hey, victory for all, no one thinks about the deep, dark, horrible things that they did. Because especially because they wrap it in that blanket of it was they were debauched and they were everything else. I mean, it was a moral thing.
Yep.
You can't get away with that as much in today's society because it's no longer moral to carpet bomb civilians. Because everyone is thinking, like he mentioned Abraham earlier, people have become more moral and more aware, and they think in that Abraham kind of terminology of like, why would you destroy a whole city? Why would you carpet bomb a city? Like, because I know there's got to be some innocent people there. I mean, Abraham calls them righteous. I'll call them innocent.
Right.
But you're like, I know that our enemies are there, or maybe some of what we perceive as enemies are there, but it doesn't equate to, okay, carpet bomb the whole place, because I'm not willing to allow the government to do that and risk the injury of children and innocent women and innocent men that have a different belief system, but they're not picking up a weapon against us or things like that. I mean, that's just me. I mean, I also personally don't, think if they're not basically at our doorstep that it's not our business, but that's a whole other thing. I'm not going to get into that. And as a final note for speaking of all of our silly wars in the Middle East where we shouldn't be, he actually brings that problem of Islam back up that I mentioned at the very, very beginning. And he says that the problem with Islam then is not that it has got the wrong moral theory, it's that it has gotten the wrong God. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you had that reaction.
Wow. Wow. So by his estimation, if Christians felt that they were commanded by God to strap bombs on them and blow up abortion clinics, they should do.
Yeah,
Boy, William Lane Craig, I hope I don't ever meet you on the street because I might just beat you up. That is horrific. That you've actually defended some of the most vile treatment of humanity that I have ever seen. that I have ever seen reported on the news. I mean, he's defending it. He's defending the women who are forced to marry their rapists. He's defending that practice. He's defending the poisoning in Afghanistan where schoolgirls had their water poisoned because they dare try to get an education.
Yep.
He's defending the suicide bombing of daycare centers and girls' schools and marketplaces. And it's only wrong because they have the wrong God.
No, well, he's actually defending that their moral like idea, this idea of objective morals and following their book. He's saying that that is completely okay.
Right.
But it's just, I mean,
it's just the wrong God.
Yeah, to
which
turn
again,
it on its head and be like, and only if you would take that same idea and direct it to my direction, then we could all get along.
Right.
Oh, God, it kills me. He also notes that he is therefore utterly arbitrary in his dealings with mankind. He's talking about God. By contrast, Christians hold that God, he's talking about Islamic God. He's saying that Islamic God, or, Allah, is utterly arbitrary in his dealings with mankind and that he just kind of stays out of it. But that Christians hold this, like, the God's, holy and loving nature that he participates in our everyday lives. And I would like to know, I am not a Islamic, like imam, so I am not a specialist on that. But from what of the Quran I've read, he doesn't seem like he's arbitrary at all. Like he always talks about, like, it is a little couched in certain terms, like pay the poor due to Muslims only. So like help the poor, but only if they're Muslim.
Right.
But he's still like because Allah loves the righteous, or because Allah loves the generous, or
so he doesn't seem that removed.
Yeah, he seems like he's like I really watch and encourage you to do these good things. I mean, he also encourages some bad things, but
I think it's also, you can make a pretty easy argument that Christian God is pretty arbitrary in his dealings with mankind.
I would, and that was actually the thing. Like after he made that comment, I kind of had that thought of like, I actually feel like our God's more arbitrary, especially in our like world today, because the Bible is just filled with all these things that God actually did. These like ordering the destruction of the Canaanites and destroying Sodom and Gomorrah and things like that. He's very involved.
Right.
Now we don't see any of that shit because he is completely removed.
Yeah.
And that's because you can't. Because if God did something in the world today, everyone would know, which is why he doesn't, because he's made up. But so at least Allah doesn't have as much, it seems in what I've read of the Quran, he doesn't have as much like, I destroyed this city or I kill these people. He is removed in that sense, but he's very much like, seems to be a part of people's lives as far as like, it talks about, if you're doing the right things, how he'll protect you, or how he'll give you shelter and guidance and things like that.
Sure.
So I actually almost feel like that's interesting from what I've seen. It feels actually more like Allah is more involved per se than God, because I don't see God a lot nowadays. So, I think I'll leave it kind of at that. But.
That is an absolutely disgusting moral theory that he's come up with. It's not. God can command. This is what I was talking about before. If the unquestionable leader can command you to do anything, what fantasy is more dangerous than that? There is not one.
Yeah.
There's not.
And we've watched him throughout the Bible change his mind, decide who he wants to kill. I mean, the fact that Abraham, even in that story, like basically argues with God, and God's like, "Oh, okay, I'll wait till there's no righteous people, and then I'll destroy it." It's like, what? Why would a mortal have to even have an argument with this guy? And why does this guy go, "Okay, yeah, you're right"? If he's the supreme writer of the objective moral system, then he changes his mind.
Oh, it just fails so hard on so many levels.
And don't argue with me that he doesn't change his mind, because all of you, as soon as we point out the bad shit in the Old Testament, you're like, no, that doesn't count anymore.
Well, yeah.
He sent Jesus, and now the New Testament's the thing. That's changing his fucking mind.
Yeah, that really is. The whole New Covenant thing, and when you think that by Christian mythology that Jesus and God the Father are the same person, it's really therefore Jesus in the Old Testament, it's the same person commanding those things in the Old Testament. So since that's the case, that Jesus and God the Father are sort of the same person, Jesus is responsible for all the stuff that goes on in the Old Testament. It doesn't, just because he changed his mind, it doesn't make all those things suddenly not immoral. Exactly. It just says we don't have to do them anymore, but they're still fucking evil.
Yeah, even if he's admitted them. He's basically admitted that they were immoral, which would make morals subjective.
Right. And if morals are subjective, by William Lane Craig's reasoning, then there is no objective morality, and therefore flipping his argument around, God couldn't exist.
Woohoo!
Which is a crap argument anyways, but I'm just saying, by his standards, God doesn't exist. Outcasts out.